step into the realm of daring ideas and transformative dialogues. This is Voices from the Edge, the podcast that pushes boundaries and ventures beyond the ordinary. Here, we confront the crucial issues that shape our world today. From the heartbeat of community challenges to the untold chronicles of leadership. From the relentless pursuit of social justice to the essential lessons in safety and lifelong learning. Voices from the Edge takes you to the crossroads of change. Because the edge is not just a boundary, it's where growth happens. It's where the real conversations begin. So lean in, be inspired, and let's explore what lies beyond the edge.
And joining us today is the marvellous Steve Hearsum.
Steve Hearsum has worked for over 20 years as an organizational consultant, coach, and more recently, supervisor. He has a keen interest in the human side of change, which in recent years that has grown into a fascination with how shame and anxiety drive behavior in organizations, particularly at senior leadership levels. He supports and challenges clients to find their edge and stretch when what they are after is more than simply better sameness, and has been described as the right kind of fly in the ointment. His work focuses on building change capability in three main ways: helping leaders develop their practice in terms of how they show up and the impact they have, working with internal and external consultants and organizational change practitioners of many a hue to develop their consulting skills. He published his first book, No Silver Bullet, Bursting the Bubble of the Organizational Quick Fix. Steve is a council member of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations and former co-chair of the OD Network Europe.
Steve, how are you?
I'm good, thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me on.
All right, Steve, where are you joining us from today?
I'm Johnny from the Monte Carlo of the south of England. That's Brighton on the coast.
Hasn't they got that lovely pier and the wheel out in the pier in it, or is that a different Brighton?
No, we had a wheel that went. We've got one pier that was burned down. We've got another pier that's still standing. Now we have something called the London Eye, which is a very phallic-looking concrete finger that sticks up with a viewing ring that goes up it. And it was wonderful in one sense, or looked very odd, and that they went bankrupt and cost our council tens of millions of pounds, but somebody's just taken it over. So we now have a concrete phallic symbol.
Maybe it's the phallic symbol or giving someone the finger, the concrete finger in the sky.
Yeah. If it was known, Brian, if it was facing more towards the US, I'm pretty sure I know who it would be giving the finger to.
Are you enjoying what's happening in the US at the moment?
Oh, I don't think enjoy is quite the right word. I don't have the kind of righteous indignation and surprise that lots of people seem to at what's happening, because I'm half German, and I remember talking to my grandmother before she died years ago, and she was explaining to me why many of her friends voted for the National Socialists in the 1930s, because nobody else was offering them any hope. They had nothing. And then she said to me, but once they got in, we suddenly went, oh my God.
Uh-huh.
And it's kind of through that lens that I look at this. That, when you have nothing, more nothing is not worse than nothing. And if something's offering you hope, even if when you kind of pick at it, it's built on solid ground. Sorry, not on sandy ground. It's still hope. Yeah.
I might have thought very early on in this administration, I went, this looks very, because, I way back in high school 100 years ago, I did actually study the rise of movements in Europe, shall we say, and I went, this is looking very familiar. This is looking very, very familiar, and I think we've had two generations and we've just forgotten.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree at all. My family is the product of a kind of systemic reconciliation across Europe. English man marries German woman. So yeah, short memories.
Yeah. When I say enjoying, I look at it and go, this is so ridiculous. If it wasn't so serious, it would be really funny.
Yeah, it's absurd in the literal sense of the word.
Yeah, yeah. But anyhow, enough of that, because I'm sure some people that listen might go, "Oh, you're a bit of a lefty there, Tom." Yeah,
Well, this. I mean, you've actually kind of made a link to the book in a sense, that
mm,
we connected over, because we're talking about politicians who are offering quick fixes for complex problems and guaranteed answers. So there is a
yeah,
link.
yeah, absolutely. And this would be the lovely book we're
That's
talking
the
about.
tone. Yes. Yeah.
Fantastic book, and I really enjoyed reading it, but also enjoyed the message. And it's one of those things that a lot of people, I don't know, grasping for straws, hoping to fix things, whether in business or in political sense. When you talk about politics, I always think when you talk about the absurd, is every 3 to 4 years we seem to do a 180 degree on public policy. And of those 3 or 4 years that a government is in power, 1.5 years is the first half years is blaming the previous government for everything and reversing everything the previous government did.
Mm.
And the last probably year is basically getting ready for the next election. So we're in this policy paralysis stage where we're too scared to do anything, and we're prepping up for the next term, perhaps.
Mm.
Um, do you find the same thing in Britain?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not quite as polarized yet as it is, say, in the US, or it's becoming in Germany, sadly, again. But for me, and again, there is a link to the psychological processes that I talk about in No Silver Bullet, which is the increasing move towards binary thinking, the taking of fixed positions, the inability to hold nuance, the unwillingness to be ambivalent about anything. It's not that easy these days to simply say, I'm actually a bit unsure about something. I'm a bit
Yeah,
ambivalent about that. On the one hand, I see this. On the other hand, I see that. And you see those patterns showing up then in organizations and in leadership teams, because you know the archetypes of great leaders, and heroic leadership is the zombie form that still refuses to die. It's not often you get senior leaders who are comfortable saying, I don't know, or I'm not sure, when actually that would be the most appropriate response to what they're facing.
yeah, yeah. There's this whole image we have of leaders. Well, a lot of us do that. If you can't give me a straight answer now, then you obviously don't know what you're talking about. You're a flip flop. You're a flim flam, and all those other words. The soft piece of celery, and it's just bizarre, because saying something or just to give an answer without actually putting in the processes in place to actually find out what we need to rectify or fix things or improve things, it seems ridiculous. So why does black and white mentality and the quick fixes that we tend to jump from, why is that so seductive for, I don't know, the public and leaders as well?
Well, if we talk about it, let's kind of let's take the leadership bit, and then we can ask the question: how might that then relate to wider patterns? So when I was doing my research, I asked the various people I interviewed. One of the questions I asked them was, "Well, what drives this need for certainty? What's underpinning it?" You'll see there's some connections to them. So in no particular order, there's the expectations we have on leaders, but that's of the leaders themselves, of their followers, of their stakeholders, shareholders, any of the people who in whose eyes they stand. And that puts a lot of weight then on clarity, on certainty, and coherence. There's the pace thing, and that's getting even worse with the last 30 years, digital technology, and now AI. And in that pace, the need to be seen to do the right thing. There's one of your links to politicians there. We have to have political fixes that are fast, even though that's utterly absurd in many of them. Then we get to the archetypes of great leaders, fast, decisive, confident, heroic, charismatic, all this stuff. Laziness, because bluntly, it's too much hard work to think too deeply about some of this stuff. There's the myth of fixability, which comes from Mark Cole and John Higgins, a kind of laziness that's underpinned by the assumptions that we have about the nature of change. And then we get to the existential stuff, the fear and anxiety of failure, of what might be discovered or revealed, about oneself or the situation, the shame you might experience if you suddenly are found not to know what to do, or not to be as powerful or all-knowing as others wish you were. And that inability of not knowing is possibly one of the most corrosive elements. Because if you think about the discourse around leadership and around politics, it is right at the heart of what one is not allowed to be. One is simply not allowed not to know. And if you transpose or kind of throw that hook back the other way to your opening question, so how does that link to politics? Where are the politicians who are comfortable saying, I don't know? We have one minister who's in government, but just before our election last year, he was being interviewed on TV or on a radio station. And bless him, I love him for this. He said, I don't know. I'm just going to text somebody and I'm going to get them to text me what our policy is on that. He did it live on air. And it was marvellous and human and real.
Good. Did he get thrown to the wolves over at that?
No, because he did it with such kind of humour and no shame whatsoever. It was just real.
Yep. I know in Australian politics in the past, we had a leader that was almost a shoo-in at the election, and lo and behold, he got asked a question about how much a cake would cost with GST added to it. Yeah. Couldn't give the answer, and literally it was like the uncertainty of that transposed into, you don't even have a clue what your policies are. So they ended up losing the election. It was quite bizarre how just one simple question and not being able to, and this is a very smart man, not to come up with the answer under pressure just like that, and the impact it had. What's the danger on relying on, I don't know, superficial or quick fixes, both within business and, let's say, the political cycle as well?
Well, we can make that link quite quickly. I mean, the principal danger is you waste a lot of time and money and effort, and they simply don't work. I mean, they may work occasionally if you get straight lucky, but if we just take one particular aspect of organisational life, namely culture, and it is more on one occasion I've come across organisations that have attempted to mandate culture change, and it doesn't work. Because it's not something you can mandate. It's more complex than that. It's relational. It's systemic. And the link to the political arena, and the most obvious one that always comes to mind when somebody asks me a question like this, is obviously we have the wonderful, stunning success that is Brexit. But we had Boris Johnson during negotiating, insofar as what he did can be called a negotiation, talking about oven-ready Brexit. And that to me is almost like the most explicit and absurd form of the silver bullet. In the same way that organisations look for silver bullets. And by the way, the term silver bullet shows up a lot in politics. If you do a search on Google or your favourite search engine, it is used often in politics. But oven-ready Brexit, the idea of this oven-ready chicken as a metaphor for the solution for a complex problem, is just as appropriate in politics as it is in business. Because if you think about it, let's just take one example, a transformation program or the implementation of ProSci or bringing in a particular thought leader are at their worst construed as oven-ready solutions.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure we were unfamiliar over here in Australia of oven-ready Brexit. It sounds like our typical 3 to 4 word slogans we have over here. We had 2 elections. I think there was one on the slogan of "Stop the Boats." So that's the lovely 3-word slogans.
Oh, sorry, our last government nickname.
Well, it does seem to work. I would say it's quite cynical to think that the population can only make decisions or are influenced by 3 to 4 word slogans rather than actually ideas with a bit more substance to it. But
but there's research that shows that is indeed the case. There's a book written, and I think it was 2007, around about then. It's referenced in No Silver Bullet by Dan Gardner. I think he's a Canadian journalist and an academic or something like that. And it's called Risk. And in it, he talks about how risk is perceived in politics and the media. And one of the things that stuck with me in it is he basically says that human beings are really poor at assessing risk in general. And at best, they can do it for a 3-year window. But beyond 3 years, we're just lousy at it. And it gets even worse the more anxious and existentially anxious we get. And there's some very, very powerful examples of that in the public domain. The most obvious one is post 9/11. And I went out to Australia that autumn of 9/11, and it was, the planes were relatively quiet and Australia was empty. I just had the run of the place. And if you might well remember this, everybody piled off planes post 9/11 thinking that it was highly dangerous. But even with 9/11, the risks of being killed in an airplane crash were way less than driving by car, and motor accidents rocketed
Yep.
in the year post 9/11. So we are very, we tend to look for kind of case studies or single examples that we can emotionally connect with, but we don't look at the data.
Yep. Yep. All right. In your book, you talk about leaders needing to develop sense-making capability. Okay. What does that actually look like in practice? And how do you develop that?
So in practice, it means really paying attention to your lived experience, and sometimes moment by moment, particularly when it's getting sticky. And you can do this either retrospectively in the moment or kind of rehearsing what might be coming, and unpacking what you're seeing and hearing, what you're thinking, what you're feeling, and what you want and need in a given situation. Why is that important? Well, if you take one piece of research from Jervis Bush and his colleague a few years ago that suggests that 80% of conflict in organisations is down to the unchecked out stories and assumptions that people then base their actions on, that is why. Because we make decisions, we get into conflict, our relationships get messy, strategy gets decided based on a set of assumptions that may not even be true, because we don't slow down long enough to reach sufficient interpersonal clarity. And so I act on the fact that I happen to believe that Tom doesn't like me, or that he sabotaged me in the last board meeting. And instead of going and checking out what you did or didn't do or say, I just double down on my story. And so my behaviour starts to be configured by that, and you will pick up on my behaviour, and then we end up in this peculiar, relational dance. Instead of how this can work, I did some work with the leadership team in the UK and a UK government regulator last year. And we built to the point, this links to your question about how you do it. It can take a bit of time. You've got to practice and develop the skills of sense making, of unpacking or meaning making, of doing dialogue. And we got to the point where we said to this leadership, there was a little bit of kind of a heart in mouth moment in the room at that point, and bless their cottons, they did. And in the plenary at the end of it, one of the exec, great woman, she said, somebody's just come up to me and they had a story about me and I'm just gobsmacked. And it wasn't that she was angry or annoyed. She was literally in total amazement and incredulity that her colleague had constructed some kind of narrative that wasn't bad necessarily or anything. It just was so divorced from reality, but they still had constructed a narrative. Now, that's for something that's not necessarily that serious, but people are making up stories all the time. So typically the way you do it is you have to develop people's reflexivity, their ability to slow down, to unpack their meaning making, to come up with some experiments that they might go and try, and then to go back out into the organisation, try that stuff, come back and work out whether it might have an impact or
not. Good. As you were saying, you've worked with quite a few organisations in the past facing disruption, change. Mm-hmm. Is there any common patterns in leadership culture that you can see or recognise that will tell you whether the organisation is going to successfully change their culture, or whether they're just going to eventually revert back to what the established norms are?
I mean, that's the multi-million billion dollar question, Tom, because I've seen, so this client I was referring to, it took them a year, and when we started with them, firstly, they had the willingness to work the provider and we said to them, we don't have the answer. We even won the business partly through writing a paper on why conventional leadership development was a waste of time and money. So they knew they were not going to get just an easy ride. And that was the first thing, being up for doing the work. The second sign was right early on, both in the diagnostic phase and in the first day we worked with them, what they were open with us and each other about, and this is the key point, with each other, was saying words to the effect of, we need to get better about talking about the things we find difficult to talk about, and owning of the fact that they kept things hidden and undiscussed. And then a willingness with that to work with us, to be challenged and to get uncomfortable. Now, if there's not a willingness to get uncomfortable and to countenance the fact that you might be wrong and to work with that, then I would say you've got zero chance. You're leaving it totally to chance. But even if you do all that work, so they're in a lot better place now than they were, and their engagement stuff and the perception of the leadership team radically changed after we did the work. In order for that to remain as positive in a year's time or 2 years' time, they're going to have to carry on doing the work. And that's the difficult bit, because it requires some grunt. And when the pressure is on, that is when people revert to type. And they decide that sense making and slowing down is just not worth the effort.
Good. All right. Organisational myths. I'm sure you've seen a few of them in your time. What's the most common ones that organisations tell themselves? And what's the impact of believing their own myths?
Oh, there's so many. Where do you want to start? I mean, just from your question, Tom, the 2 or 3 that drop into my awareness. So one of the myths I've already mentioned, that you can do top-down culture change. You can mandate culture change and behaviour change. No, you can't at all. That's possibly one of the biggest ones, because pretty much every change in organisations is ultimately going to be a culture change, one way or the other. It's behavioural. There's other myths around the things we love to turn into abstractions. So the biggest one has been change itself, that you can land it, that you can drive it, that it's a thing. Change is not a thing. The moment you turn it into a thing and you construe it as a thing, then you've mythologized it, and you're not working with reality. I think the really pervasive myths around leadership are a problem. I mean, heroic leadership has not died, and actually, if you take what are supposedly some of the more thoughtful styles, and let's just tip a hat to the fact the whole notion of leadership styles is really problematic anyway. But leader as follower and servant leadership are just a kind of a rebadged form of heroic leader. So we've got many pervasive myths. I mean, one of the ones that gets under my skin regularly, and I had a go at this again on LinkedIn this week on one of Simon Sinek's posts, because again, what emerged was this using change resistance as a binary label for anybody who doesn't go along with top-down led change or defined change. It's a myth that everybody who resists change is resisting or doesn't want change to happen. So what's common to all of these is actually a need to oversimplify and make something that is actually quite complex easier to understand. But in doing that, it also makes it easier to dismiss or to deny or to imagine that there's a really easy way of fixing it. You turn it into the equivalent of a nail when it's not.
Okay. In your book, you talk about unlearning. Unlearning is part of a critical part of leadership. First of all, I'm guessing that can't be an easy process, because we tend to learn from experiences in life, or what we've been taught or what we've heard or what we've read. Is it a hard process to unlearn what you've taken for given? And can you give an example of when unlearning has actually made a difference for a client?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, so let's put this in a very human context. So anybody who's listening who has had challenges in terms of their relationships or family systems or so on, or has been in any form of therapy or got support, I would suggest gently that has involved unlearning and reframing the stories and narratives that you've lived your life around for as many years as you've been on the planet. So if I think about myself, I had to unlearn how I had learned to defend myself against the things I found incredibly anxiety inducing in my family system. My father, lovely as he was an alcoholic. Not a violent one, but his behaviour was very challenging. So I had to unlearn my coping strategies, my defensive strategies, in order to become happier, healthier, and more functional. And in my work, I had to unlearn some of those things related to that, even well into my 40s. So it's not easy. It requires a willingness. Again, going back to discomfort. You know, one of the reasons I talk to new clients about. Well, I say to new clients, I create useful discomfort in service of learning, is because for this kind of work, anything you've learned in your life that's probably been worth learning has been preceded by a wriggle and wrestle. I mean, there may be the odd epiphany, but mostly it requires some work. So that's the first thing. You know, what have I seen? I was actually told a story by one of my clients, and it's a rare example of what you, to use your language there, Tom, of unlearning, but more importantly, of becoming aware and then considering the implications for what you might need to unlearn. And this was from the CEO of a very large UK technology company. And over the last 3 or 4 years, there's a cultural aspect of this, because he's from Germany, and I'm half German, so I'm allowed to say this. He had some of the best and the worst of the Germanic leadership traits. You know, very decisive, very clear about what he wanted, very, very driving. And he attempted to transform this organisation, but he did it top down. He brought in expert consultants, and it was, the polite term, a bit of a mess. But here's the thing. Early in 2024, apparently, he turned around to the organisation and he apologised. He said, I've got it wrong. We got it wrong. We shouldn't have done it that way. We're going to do it again, and this time we're going to talk to you. And that, to me, goes to the heart of the unlearning bit, which is you have to be willing to admit and acknowledge where you got it wrong.
Yep.
And I sometimes talk about wrongness with clients. You know, when was the last time you actually said, you know, hands up, I'm wrong, and didn't qualify it? So I think key to unlearning is a willingness and a humility to accept when you just got stuff plain wrong. And it goes back to our opening dialogue and conversation about politics. You know, if politicians were able to say more easily and be allowed to say more easily, we get the leaders we deserve, I got that wrong, we might not trash all the learning that's there to be derived.
Yeah. All right. Writing the book. What was the biggest surprise in both researching and actually writing the book?
Oh, nobody's ever asked me quite that question, Tom. The biggest surprise, I suppose, well, writing when you've got caring responsibilities at two ends of the generational spectrum in the middle of it is, you know, the biggest surprise was just how much time that would take out, which is why it took 4 years to write. So that was a tough surprise, but there was learning in that as well. But I suppose the thing that comes to mind in terms of surprise, two things. One is to find that the real unlocking of the narrative and the hypothesis happened only by chance, which was one of my early interviews with Graham Curtis, where this idea of functional collusion came out, and it was based on his PhD research. So, you know, starting to write a book, thinking you're onto something, but really the thread or the gift that really made it work in some key respects, or kind of gave my hypothesis something that explained it, was one interview and something that emerged from it. And had I not had that conversation with Graham, and had I not arranged to talk to him, I wouldn't have known that. And I don't think it would have been anywhere near the book it is. The other thing, I suppose, that surprised me is that I read all the advice about how you're supposed to write a business book. And in hindsight, I followed it to a point, and then I went free range. I went feral. And what I mean by that is, if anybody's thinking about writing a book, I would highly recommend you do this, which is give as many early chapters as you can to people you trust who are going to be honest. Not all of them will read them, but the ones that do will probably offer you some gold. And one of my friends and colleagues, Mark Cole, said to me when he read he was the first person to read a draft of a chapter. He said, "It's fine, Steve. You know, you can write, but the thing that makes it different is your personality and you." And I think that was a surprise, how much just allowing myself to speak through my voice would be the thing that made it actually worth reading in some respects.
Yeah, good. All right, we're running low on time, but if listeners were to read your lovely book, No Silver Bullet, And if they were to take, if you were able to just pass on one thing that they could take and apply in their life, not as a quick fix, but as a long-term learning, what would it be?
I'm going to couple two. I'm going to cheat slightly and bolt two together in one statement, which is listen deeply and ask better questions.
Yeah. Is that just for me?
No, actually, there is a kind of just a kicker in that, which is when I asked every person I interviewed, I said two things. One, is there a silver bullet for complex problems? Nobody said there was. And the second question I said to follow up with was, in the absence of that, what's the next best thing? And pretty much everybody, one way or the other, said the same thing. They said, get as many people together as you can with permission to ask any question. And then maybe, just maybe, you'll work out what's going on and what you can do as a next wise move. So the asking questions bit is fundamental to this.
Yeah, excellent. All right, Steve Hearsum, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking today, and I really do appreciate you giving up our time for us. But for now, we're going to have to call a close. And hopefully, sometime in the future, you may consider coming back on, and I'll work on some better questions maybe.
No, thank you, Tom. Love to.
Thanks for listening to Voices from the Edge. If you like what we are doing, like the episode and the podcast, subscribe so you won't miss any future episodes and leave a positive review.